Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Whip Union, and in this one there's been several advances by the Russians and a single advance by the Ukrainians. The Russians continued advances both within the Sumy region and the Kursk region. The Russians continued advances across the Usk river line and the Zherebets river line in the eastern section of the front line. The Russians also started new operations to the southwest of Pokrovsk in the direction of the Dnipropetrovsk border area, covering 3 kilometers and are now 3 kilometers from the border area in certain sections of the front line. The Russians also managed to enter Rusliv, reverse the situation in Lysivka, and advance within several additional towns. The Russians also managed to continue the advances in the Zaporizhia section of the front line, while the Ukrainians managed to enter and gain a foothold within Popovka in the Belgorod region. Starting out in the southern section of the front line, the Russians managed to advance within the town of Zherebets. This is based on geolocated footage. The Ukrainians still have some footholds within the northeastern parts of the town, but the majority is now under Russian control. In the Donetsk section of the front line, we see that there are several advances by the Russians from the southeast of Pokrovsk and all the way to the northwest of Velika Novosilka. The Russians have made several advances here, gaining a foothold within the town of Vesele along the Mokry Yeli river line. The Russians also managed to gain a foothold within Rusliv to the southwest of Konstantinopel. The Russians secured the final remaining area along the main highway between Pokrovsk and Andriivka, connecting with Kurakhove. Here in the western section of the front line, further securing the supply roads of the Russian forces. The Russians also managed to gain a foothold within Bohdanivka and made a 3-kilometer breakthrough south of Kotlyarivka, reaching the outskirts of the town. And the Russians also managed to reverse the situation within Lysivka, re-entering the northern parts of the river line. In the direction of Vesele along the Mokry Yeli river line, the Russians have recently captured the first patch area northwest of Dnipro, as well as with their advance along the main road. The Russians are now advancing towards Vesele both from the eastern and southern directions. The Russians managed to bypass the fortified positions by crossing over the Mokry Yeli river line following the capture of the first patches, and combined with those forces, the Russians managed to break through the Ukrainian fortifications at the southern parts of the town, allowing the Russians to gain a foothold within the town. The Russians will look to gain control over Vesele to secure a bridgehead across the defensive line of the Ukrainians here north of Shevchenko and near Vesele, which is the final defensive line of the Ukrainians in the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region. The Russians also launched an assault into Rusliv, gaining control over several buildings in the central parts of the town, and with this the Russians have secured one road into the northeastern parts of it. This advance by the Russians following the securing of the southern flank of Konstantinopel has allowed them to gain a foothold within Rusliv. This is despite their Ukrainian efforts to regain control over Konstantinopel. The Russians are here looking to strengthen the offensive operations from the eastern section of the front line to move onwards towards Bahatir and connect with their forces from the southwestern and eastern parts. For this, they need to gain control over Rusliv and Konstantinopel. Securing both of these towns will open up the road towards Bahatir. At the same time, the Russians continue securing the northern flank of Andriivka. To secure the northern flank will allow them to push along the main highway towards Oleksivka and beyond. Again, facing off against Ukrainian counterattacks, the Russians are here securing their flanks before moving onwards along the main road. The Russians also managed to gain a foothold within the town of Bohdanivka, which is one of the remaining 5 towns here along the border area between Donetsk and the Dnipropetrovsk regions. The Russians also managed to break through some of the positions of the Ukrainians here south of Kotlyarivka, cutting off the main road between Kotlyarivka and Troitske, as well as Horyhove. This also allows the Russians to attack both of the flanks of the 3 towns in the center, which is Preobrazhenka, Troitske, and Horyhove. The objective of the Russians is to launch a pincer maneuver, bypassing these towns, especially Preobrazhenka, which is on the front line and now isolated and encircled from 3 directions, with the only road being from Preobrazhenka towards Troitske, which the Russians are attacking through the direction of Bohdanivka, as well as from the direction of Kotlyarivka. Russians are here looking to start the battle over Troitske, which will prevent the Ukrainians from withdrawing from Preobrazhenka and encircle the Ukrainian forces located in the area. At the same time, it will also allow the Russians to bypass the Ukrainian lines, which are mainly centered around the eastern flank near Preobrazhenka. They naturally also have fortified positions in the northern and southern flanks. However, the Russians now have a wider pressure on the Ukrainian forces from the northern, eastern, and southern directions. With the recent advances by the Russians to the south of these towns, the Russians have also significantly improved their positions from this direction, and we can see that the fortified positions of the Ukrainians here along the main highway west of Kharkiv are all situated and facing the southern direction. This means that a Russian control and capture over the towns in the north will allow them to flank the fortified positions from their rear and attack their weak spot. At the same time, we see that the main supply route and really the only highway going in to supply the village chain and fortified positions along the main highway is going through Novopavlivka. This means the Russian push in the western direction to push across the Dnipropetrovsk border area would allow them to cut off the main supply route of the Ukrainian forces in this direction. This means that the Ukrainian supply route for their forces along the northern bank of the Vovcha River line west of Kharkiv is in danger due to this assault by the Russian forces. We can also see that the strengthening of Russian operations here in the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region is a result of two things. The first one is that the advances significantly slowed down at the start of February and throughout the month of March. While the Ukrainians have launched significant counterattacks in the Pokrovsk section of the front line to cut off the bridgehead of the Russians that is attempting to flank the city, the Russians will be relieving pressure by launching their own offensive operations further south, force the Ukrainians to spread out their forces further from Pokrovsk in the northeast to Vesele and Velikonovasilka in the southwest. At the same time as the Russians launch their own offensive operations in this whole area, where they've constantly been launching their own counterattacks in response to the Ukrainian counterattacks, where the objective is to match the Ukrainian pressure and then take advantage of their numerical advantage and their firepower advantage to spread out the front line even further. So with this, we can see that the Russians here are looking to dislodge the Ukrainian capacity to launch counterattacks, while at the same time making some gains by attacking the fortified positions in their weak points, the supply lines to these fortified positions, and flanking the Ukrainian positions wherever possible. To the southeast of Pokrovsk, the Russians regained control over most of the southern parts of Lysivka and managed to re-enter the northern parts of the town, as we see with this geolocated footage. As previously mentioned, when the Ukrainians recaptured large parts of the town 2 weeks ago, the frontline situation within Lysivka is very unstable, as there's been a lot of back and forth over the past few months. The entire town can really be considered as a gray zone because Russian and Ukrainian soldiers have switched hands a considerable number of times throughout these past months, which makes it unclear who controls what at what point. All we can do is make use of the most recent geolocated footage, which shows the Ukrainians recently captured the southern parts, and now the Russians have recaptured much of it and re-entered the northern parts. Moving on to the eastern section of the front line, the Russians have managed to advance further across the Zherebets river line, gaining control over additional fortified positions, reaching the outskirts of Katerinivka, fighting over the forest patch right at the outskirts of it, as well as in the direction of Nova, while at the same time securing some fortified positions in the northern flank of Novolyubivka. Exactly as I predicted, once the Russians started fighting over the fortified positions moving in the northern direction, the Russians here would be moving along the fortified lines, both the first line and the second line, combining in a double assault to gain control over the fortified positions from their side, from the weak point, to advance in the northern direction, connecting the forces in this direction and expanding their bridgehead across the Zherebets river line, significantly widening it, allowing for a larger concentration of forces across, while at the same time isolating the Borova section of the front line to the north from the Liman section of the front line to the south, where the Russians will look to advance along the fortified positions all the way towards the Uska river line, before moving onwards towards Liman to the south and Borova to the north, through a combined assault from the northern and southern flanks from both of these directions, and with the continued fighting over the eastern bank of the Zherebets river line as well, we will see continuous attempts by the Russian forces to advance in all of these separate directions. Across the Uskar river line, the Russians managed to gain control over the town of Krasnopershe, as well as additional forest patch areas following their new bridgehead across near the Dvorishensky National Park. The Russians continued their operations to expand their bridgehead across the Uskar river line, where the objective is to gain control over the entire Uskar river line from the northern flank and continuing down southwards and expanding onwards from Dvorishna as the main supply hub, both towards Kupiansk in the south and in the western direction to connect with Vovchansk in the future, and also to expand the bridgehead across to connect with the border area between the Russian and Ukrainian side of the border. In the Belgorod region, the Ukrainians have managed to enter and gain a foothold within Popovka, as we see with this geolocated footage. The Russians launched some FPV drone strikes on the Ukrainian positions that were located at the outskirts of the town from the southern direction. We see a lot of fighting between the Russian and Ukrainian forces, where the positions within the towns themselves, similar to Lysivka, can change hands a lot as the Russians enter with some of their forces, mainly with artillery cover, and then the Ukrainians respond with an armored assault, dropping off their infantry to gain a foothold within these towns. The fighting continues over both Demidovka and Popovka, where the outcome has not been decided here almost 2 weeks into the offensive. In the Kursk and Sumy regions, the Russians continue their advances. They have managed to advance further on the Sumy part of the border area. Following the capture of the border crossing, the Russians have secured the eastern parts of Besivka, leaving just a small part of the residential area remaining under Ukrainian control, as the Russians will likely expand their offensive operations both along the Luknia river line towards Luknia and along the main highway towards Yunikivka, while at the same time the Russians have reached the outskirts of Oleshnia, both from the northern and eastern directions, which indicates that the Russians will likely soon gain control over that town as well, as it is fairly isolated from the Ukrainian side of the border. The main road is connecting through the main highway, which means that Oleshnia can be considered operationally encircled from 3 directions. At the same time, fighting also continues in the southern parts, where the Ukrainians remaining bridgehead across the Kursk region, leaving now only about 30 square kilometers under Ukrainian control, which is less than 3% of their peak control over areas within the Kursk region. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.